stone and the soil mortars, very well laid out, flagstone floor. And again, the fire hearth, and behind here was a ventilator to bring that fresh air into the home. Then also, just remarkably well-preserved wooden beams that would have supported the roof in this house. And the preservation of the wood was something that I didn't expect. I thought being buried for 1,000 years, or nearly 1,000 years, that the wood would have rotted away, and that we wouldn't have a whole lot left. But come to find out, there were upright posts that supported the roof. There were beams that laid across horizontally to help support the upper wall as well. And by the way, the wood that we found in these homes, we can use to do dendrochronology, or we can look at the tree rings in those sections of wood and figure out how old that site or that particular house is, when it may have been constructed. But being so close to the river, most of the wood that they were using was probably driftwood that floated in on the river into giant piles. And why not? If there was a giant pile of logs that are already stripped of bark and their branches and can be fairly quickly processed into beams, they were probably using those. And those species of trees don't typically produce tree rings that are suitable for dendrochronology or tree ring dating. So time will tell how successful we will be in actually dating those beams. But just for the fact that they're there and they're integrated with the stone masonry, it's pretty remarkable to see that preservation. Another site, the Axe Handle Alcove site, a little farther up the river near Lee's Ferry. It's formed by an alcove or a rock shelter that the cliff forms one side of, and then there's a small bench land above the Colorado River here. And the remarkable thing about this site was how old some of the artifacts were, and also how the river flooded the site numerous times, but that people continue to reoccupy and reuse that rock shelter. These are some of the features that we found at Axe Handle. Little fire hearths that were dug into the floor of the alcove, stone piles or pits that would have been used for as either hearths or cooking features. And really, for geomorphologists, this is pretty exciting. And for archaeologists, it's pretty exciting to see all these different layers and levels in that profile, or that cut in the soil. Shows a record of when people lived there. So you have deposits of cultural material, charcoal and ash and artifacts. And that is interspersed with layers of wind-blown sand and flood deposits. So, prior to Glen Canyon Dam being built, the Colorado River flooded probably on an annual basis, and at times flooded very big. So the alcove itself is not that far off the river, but it's high enough that our current floods don't reach anywhere near the level of the alcove. But of course, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the river flooded this alcove and covered up some of that cultural material, and then people continued to go back and reuse it. Again, beautiful pottery, this time coming from the Blacktail site. Very nicely made, and very, it's just something to hold an artifact that old in your hand. And of course the pottery, this is a shaped vessel, and the pottery is, tells us how old and what culture, but also the function of particular areas in an archaeological site. Of course, those kinds of artifacts are aesthetically pleasing. They're the pretty ones. They're the ones that people hold in their hands and have their friends take pictures of. We also have artifacts that, okay, they're nice, but nobody wants to hold a chunk of burned log or a piece of original mortar in their hands and take a picture of it. It's hard to pose with a chunk of charcoal in your hand, I guess. But these artifacts are just as valuable for telling us something about those sites. What species of wood is this? Why did that little room in this house burn down? How much is there of it? That type of construction is very unique. The technique to build a room with upright logs and then mud packed on either side of it is something archaeologists call Hough construction, or wattle and daub. And we find it in relation to well-built masonry rooms. But why did these people choose to build a Hough wall near a masonry room? This particular area of this site, this was the Evo site again, was probably a kneeling room. And right here in this part of the photograph, you can see a stone that's standing straight up, and then these little pedestals here. And it looks like there was a metate that was cemented into the floor of this room. And whatever burned here, for whatever reason that room burned, the people had time to remove that metate before the room burned and leave it. And it makes us wonder whether this room wasn't burnt intentionally. And that is something that we find in the archaeological record too, either to clean it out or some other reason. And of course, the mortar that was used in the construction of these masonry rooms is very interesting, because if you look at the types of sediments that are along the Colorado River, they're very silty and sandy, and there's not a lot of clay in them. So it was kind of puzzling to see this 1,000-year-old mortar still in place, and if you tap on it, it's still very durable, and it's still holding that wall together like it did the first day it was built. Where did they get that clay? Where did they go, or how did they trade for it? Pretty interesting to think about how much they needed to build a wall, and how did they get that material there during construction. We don't have the answer to that one. We're looking at it, but we don't have the final answer. Then other artifacts that we're looking at: burned corn cobs, good evidence that people were raising corn. It's not something you buy at Safeway back then. It's 1,000 years old. They were growing it along the Colorado River. And pollen from the corn plant. If you take soil and process it in a lab, you can isolate the individual grain pollens, and they're very unique in their shape and their morphology. And you can identify the different species of plants that may have produced that pollen. So the question is, were the foods they were eating wild plant foods, or were they agricultural foods? If you have a good sample of pollen, you can tell the difference. And one of the things we found at the Palisades site related to agriculture was evidence that they were possibly growing cotton at that location. And that is not something that we see very often, direct evidence for cotton agriculture. But there was an NAU master's thesis that looked at the different types of plants that people were growing, and she found cotton in there. What were they doing with the cotton? Of course, they would have been making clothing, basketry, and other household wares. Boy, this guy dug himself into a hole, didn't he? The soil itself tells us quite a bit about an archaeological site, how it's deposited, what the origin of that soil is. And it helps us relate one part of the site to the other. And of course, how old the site may be, you can tell by the different positions of the layers in the soil itself. And so we have geomorphologists working with us to try to reconstruct the landscape at the time that people lived there, what the processes were after people left, how the site was buried. And the three primary processes that we look at are wind-blown sediments, sediments or soils that wash down from the slopes of the Grand Canyon, and then flood deposits. So how did we do? What are some